Do you remember when Pokemon games weren't so controversial? When instead of people constantly debating over whether the newest installment is a cash grab or a step in the right direction, a game would come out and it would just be universally loved? We haven't had an uncontentious good Pokemon game since Platinum, and that released 15 years ago. So today, for the sake of some positivity, I thought I'd talk about Pokemon Emerald. It was the third updated version of Ruby and Sapphire, basically the definitive edition of those two games. I'll be talking about all the good stuff in all three of the games, and specifying the new stuff Emerald added when I think it's appropriate. Most of the changes were really good, which is why, despite it being 2 decades old at this point, it's one of the few Pokemon games that virtually everyone still loves, and I thought it'd be interesting to talk about why. Let's not waste any more time and jump right into it. Every game series out there has a few things that it really needs to get right for its audience to enjoy it. Mario games need fun movement, Fallout needs a good story, and Dark Souls needs a careful balance of fairness and difficulty. For Pokemon games, while it's definitely a lot of work, the list is actually pretty short. You need a bunch of cool Pokemon, solid graphics, a story that is charming and interesting, or at least doesn't get in the way of the gameplay too much, and most importantly, a strong sense of exploration. Pokemon Emerald nails all 4 of these. First things first, the Pokemon. With each new generation of Pokemon, there's a huge outcry about how a bunch of the designs are terrible, ugly, and boring, and to be honest, a lot of that is deserved. Many Pokemon just kinda suck. It's bound to happen when there are over 1,000 of them. And while a lot of the new ones are bad too, let's be honest, Spidops looks like a freak, it's a problem Pokemon has always had. In each new generation of Pokemon, at least 20% of the roster is bound to be bad. It's like a law of nature. It's either that or they only introduce a few dozen new Pokemon like in Gen 6 and 7. The one exception to this rule? The Hoenn games. Really think back on Gen 3. How many new Pokemon do you genuinely dislike? How many would you want fully removed from the game? Because for me personally, I can only think of 10. Nosepass, Plusle and Minun, Volbeat and Illumise, Roselia, Spinda, the Cradily line, and specifically Shuppet. I think Bennett is cool. That's about 7% of the total new Pokemon, which is insanely low compared to the 20% or so I outright dislike from Black and White and Red and Blue, or the 30% from Gold and Silver. Lukewarm take of the year, Gen 2 of the worst Pokedex in classic Pokemon. Anyway, Emerald's Pokedex is really solid. I don't have quite as many all-time favorites from Hoenn, but there's very little here to dislike. While none of them are in my top 3, all of the starter picks are pretty great and bring something unique to the table. You've got Swampert for bulk, Blaziken for strength, and Sceptile for speed. Unusually, the early Pokemon are good too. Myena, Swellow, and Gardevoir are awesome, Masquerain, Breloom, and Ludicolo are super charming, and even if we're just talking about the pre-evolutions, they're consistently cute and interesting in their own ways. Then once you get to Dewford Town, you can go into Granite Cave, where you can find the Aron and Makahita lines, which are both awesome. There's so many cool Pokemon in the first bit of the game that I'll usually have 4 or 5 in my party before the second gym. It honestly ends up being a huge problem for me, since it means if I want to catch any later on, I'll have to start switching them out. And I'll usually do that. Once you get to the mid and late game, there's still a bunch of choices that are actually worth taking. Even past the 5th gym, you're still getting stuff like Tropius, Absol, Banette, Ninetales, Wailord, and Walrein. In a lot of Pokemon games, there'll be these sort of dead spots, where for a large portion of the game, there'll be no new interesting Pokemon. For example, in Red and Blue, from Route 3 all the way to Route 9, you'll basically be getting the same array of Pokemon every single route, with only one new one, if even that. And most of the new ones aren't even good. Sinnoh has the same problem for 209 to 213, where for 4 straight routes, you don't get a whole lot of new, interesting stuff. These sorts of areas are where Pokemon games start to feel boring and samey, like you're going through the motions, and it can make their mid-games really start to drag. But in Emerald, virtually every single route brings something new to the table. The only real exception are the water routes, but they're all pretty short and later in the game when the end of the world stuff is happening, so there's a lot of travel to new areas to break them up anyway. There's exactly one complaint I have with the way Emerald handles its Pokemon. See, I love Masquerain, but for some godforsaken reason, despite Surskit being obtainable in both Ruby and Sapphire, there is no legal way to get it in Pokemon Emerald. In fact, the same is true for 4 other Pokemon lines, which are completely impossible to find in the base game, despite being available in one of the other 2 games. Surskit, Meditite, and Roselia are available in both previous games, yet bizarrely, you can't find any of these very common trainer Pokemon in Emerald. I will never understand this game decision. Emerald is supposed to be the definitive edition of the Hoenn region, and yet it doesn't include a significant number of the most iconic Pokemon out there. It's a real shame too, because I really love Masquerain, and I simply can't use it in this game. Okay, I've stalled long enough. I need to talk about one of my favorite Pokemon of all time, right in Petalburg Woods. Guys, please don't judge me when I say this. I love Slacking. This big sloth thing is so disgustingly aloof that he just wormed his way into my heart. First you find a Slackoth and it's awful. It's pretty weak to begin with, but tack on its ability basically having its attack stats and you're looking at something pathetically helpless. It's hot garbage, but in that sort of charming way, like trying to push a friendly but lazy cat into completing an obstacle course. Then it evolves into Vigoroth and it's a big improvement, a very solid Pokemon for that point in the game, but nothing too special. But finally, at level 36, it evolves one final time and we end up with this glorious creature. This fat, disgusting, lazy jerk is what you're left with, and it's regained Slackoth's awful ability. I guess working hard wasn't right for it. It's not evil like some Pokemon are, but it's clearly very unpleasant, mean, and probably smells awful. And honestly, I love that. It's really strangely charming. And you know what else it is? One of the most powerful Pokemon of all time, on par with gods. And if you don't find that absolutely hilarious, I don't know what to tell you. It also makes it super fun to use, since it's weirdly fast, unbelievably bulky, and hits like 17 semi-trucks strapped to the end of a sledgehammer. Combine that with a solid healing move, and it's actually a pretty good single-player Pokemon. Just don't fight Pelipper. They have Protect and Supersonic, so with your Truant ability, they can basically decide to make you lose. I kid you not, I once went 20 turns against one without landing a single attack. Now that I'm done with my slacking rant, it's the right time to discuss the ways the Gen 3 games completely upended the series. You know, we kinda have to judge video games by the standards of their time. Graphically speaking, a game in 2019 is simply going to be able to do more than a game in 2004, so it's more about judging how much better each game looks than its predecessor. And the same thing applies for other things in the series, like Pokemon design and game balance. And in this sense, Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald are arguably the best Pokemon games ever made. Let's start with the graphical upgrades, since I was already talking about them. The first two generations of Pokemon were not pretty. The sprite work left a lot to be desired, and the few colors they used clashed with each other a lot. Then we get to the Hoenn games, the first ones that actually look good. The color choices are really pleasing, all of the different characters look distinct and interesting, and every Pokemon now has an appealing and unique sprite, even in the menu. Plus, they implemented actual shading for the first time in any of these games, which makes all the characters pop out so much more. There are a few funky sprites, in particular the female Magma Grunt looks really weird, but for the most part this game still looks quite good today. A fun fact, Emerald actually changed some of the sprites from Ruby and Sapphire to clean them up a bit. For example, they gave the old bald men actual foreheads and turned Meteor Falls a nice shade of purple instead of a bright gold yellow. They also brought back animated sprites. Instead of the Pokemon just standing there like cardboard cutouts, they do a little move before the beginning of the fight to show some personality. Then there are the gameplay changes. First of all, abilities. These have to be one of the most universally beloved things about the game series. Giving every single character in the game a little status effect they'll have on them 24/7 makes them feel so much more unique. Before you'd have two mediocre bug types and both of them were functionally identical, besides how they looked. Now one of those bug types gets a speed boost at the end of every turn and the other can only be hit by super effective moves. It exponentially increased the number of different strategies you can use and made a bunch of previous terrible Pokemon actually decent. For example, Butterfree was a fan favorite, but pretty awful, and then the Gen 3 games came along, it got Compound Eyes, and suddenly it could reliably hit a sleep move 100% of the time. Suddenly, Pokemon wasn't just about clicking the move that would do the most damage and occasionally paralyzing the opponent. It was this complex web of abilities that lower attack, protect from paralysis, and only let you move every other turn. The Hoenn games also added a ton of the good early held items. Technically, Gen 2 introduced held items as a concept, but basically all they had were ones that boosted a type's attack power by 10%, leftovers, and berries named stuff like Pissin Cure Berry and Purz Cure Berry. Don't get me wrong, it was a great addition and stuff like Leftovers and the King's Rug were cool, but it was still super simplistic. Then Ruby and Sapphire came along and added stuff like the choice items, Macho Brace, Shell Bell, and Soothe Bell, which are all great. And when it came to berries, the Gen 3 games leaped in with a steel chair. They kept all the berries from Gold and Silver, but gave them actual names and interesting designs, and then went on to add 18 new berries with new effects, and then another 14 that you could use as ingredients in Pokeblocks. Then, instead of picking them off a tree like a peasant, you could plant them in the ground and actually farm them to get more. But that's not all! This was also the first generation of Pokemon to include double battles, which are insanely fun and really strategically interesting. Instead of just hitting the opponent with a damaging move over and over, you can have both of your Pokemon gang up on one of the opponents, use Encore to force one of them to protect while you deal with the other, Helping Hand with one of the Pokemon to boost the other, or any number of other cool strategies that simply weren't possible before. And then, in Pokemon Emerald, they made it so random unrelated trainers could also go into double battles with you, letting you choose if you wanted to fight them each individually or both at the same time. And finally, for the competitive players, you have EVs and natures. Basically, every time you fight a wild Pokemon, you get a bit of experience in one specific stat, like fighting a Zigzagoon and getting one speed EV. With more EVs, your stats will raise above the normal amount, and you'll get a Blaziken that's faster or tougher than normal. But you can only get a maximum of 512 EVs, and each one of your stats would max out at 252, meaning you could only fully train a Pokemon in up to 2 stats. This basically let people customize their Pokemon, training them in certain areas to exact amounts to make them as powerful as possible. Like this Claydol, I'll give it 252 EVs in HP to make it bulky, then 224 in attack so it can hit hard, and 32 in special attack, since that's exactly the amount the move Psychic needs to one-shot a Gengar under certain conditions. Then each Pokemon also has a nature, which will usually slightly boost one of its stats and lower another. All of this stuff doesn't increase your stats by ridiculous amounts, only about 30 to 40% once they're all maxed out, but especially in competitive play, that extra bit is super important. I consider Generation 3 to be the birth of modern Pokemon. While Red and Blue started the series, the first 2 generations of games were pretty simple. Then Gen 3 came along and added abilities which basically doubled the possible strategic complexity of the game, and then did the same thing again 2 more times with held items and EVs. And you can double it all again if you're in a double battle. You don't really have to deal with this stuff at all, but if you want to play competitive Pokemon or do a Nuzlocke or something, over half the mechanics you'll be using to make your strategies were added in just these games. As much as I love Pokemon Black and White, it had nowhere near the positive lasting impact on the series the Gen 3 games did. In fact, Black and White's commercial failure was arguably what led to a ton of the problems modern Pokemon is facing. If you want to point to the games that made Pokemon, besides Red and Blue, Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald are probably the ones to go to. Speaking of red, have you checked out the subscribe button? I know it's technically black now, but it's still red in my heart, and I refuse to acknowledge otherwise. If you like my stuff, I'd really appreciate it. And a comment, just telling me about your day, why not? Anyway, the Gen 3 games weren't all mechanics and boring junk like that. I think it's about time we talk about the actual story of these games. Ruby and Sapphire did this really interesting thing with their stories where you'd get a different plot in each version of the game. In Ruby, you were fighting Team Magma, and in Sapphire, you'd battle Team Aqua. In both games, the evil team would be trying to revive an ancient legendary Pokemon to reshape the world. Groudon for Ruby and Kyogre for Sapphire. They try to take control of the Pokemon, it doesn't work, and the legend starts wreaking havoc. You have to go to the Cave of Origin in Sootopolis City, where you can defeat the legendary Pokemon once and for all. Then the evil team, their ideology proven wrong, decides to mellow out. Pokemon Emerald doesn't do that. Since it was the third version of 2 games with different plots, Emerald did the only rational thing and Dragon Ball fused the 2 stories into one long, ludicrously epic plotline. This game has you fighting both evil teams at once, with the 2 of them clashing in gang warfare all across the region. You meet them at the top of Mount Pyre, infiltrate both of their secret bases, take down the leaders, and watch as they revive both of the legendary Pokemon at the same time. The 2 of them start to battle in a world-ending catastrophe with quite literally apocalyptic weather causing a threat to the safety of the entire region. You, the player, have to team up with the champion of the region to travel to the Sky Pillar and awaken Rayquaza, the 3rd legendary Pokemon, who quells the battle between the 2, causing peace to once again reign in the region. In all seriousness, I really do like a lot about this plot. Both of the teams are really aesthetically interesting, with Team Magma being nerdy technocrats with all sorts of fancy machinery, while Team Aqua are traditionalists who get around in boats and submarines and use their fists more than their heads. I really like the look of Team Aqua in particular, and always thought Archie was awesome. He isn't as personally aggressive toward the player as Maxie is, and has a strangely thoughtful way of speaking, so it's always a pleasure when he shows up. And the whole ending is pretty epic, honestly. I also really like that each of the gym leaders got brand new teams for Emerald. Some of the ones from Ruby and Sapphire were pretty lame, but there isn't a single one from Emerald that I don't like. There are only really 2 changes I didn't like. The first is that it's really hard for a new player to find the Team Magma hideout without looking it up. They're basically just handed the Magma emblem and are expected to backtrack all across the game until they come across it near the bottom of Jagged Pass. The other one is that Wallace is the champion instead of Steven Stone, and he's a much lamer final battle than Steven. Although Steven retiring and Wallace moving up did give us Hoenn, a womanizer so incredibly charming that the entire bottom half of his gym is full of attractive female trainers who want to go out with him. So I guess I can't complain. Best character in the game, let's be honest. I take it back, the Magma emblem is the only issue I have. All that being said, the main story is not really what draws me into this game. See, what they never tell you about this game is how insanely fun it is. Pokemon Emerald oozes charm and joy out of every last pore it has, like a happy, disgusting, sweaty man. You'll be walking around exploring Route 119 until suddenly you come across this random house with a guy out front. You talk to him and he tells you about how he didn't understand how everyone was flying around and tried just getting a whole bunch of birds to carry him around. Only later did he discover that you have to use the HM move Fly, and he ended up getting really embarrassed. And then you walk around the house and it's full of Wingles. He kept the Wingles after his plan didn't work. This is the sort of thing I'm talking about. If you take the time to talk to the NPCs and explore, you'll constantly be coming across these little bits of charm or humor that make the world a bit more enjoyable. It's kinda hard to overstate how many of these little instances there are. There are at least 3 or 4 in every town and on every route. A few of these got pretty famous, like the fact that in Lava Ridge Town, you can go to the back of the Pokemon Center and hang out in this hot spring with some old women. If you talk to this old guy, he'll talk about how nice and warm the sands are before getting bit in the butt by a Pokemon, and there's this kid in the bottom right house who talks like an old man because the whole town is overrun with senior citizens. None of this stuff is remotely important to the story of the game, but it's so cute and fun that I go out of my way to find it whenever I play the game. Because if you do, you'll meet people like the Yes Town guy. He asks you what town you're from, but since the game only ever gives you yes-no questions, the only answers you can give are yes or no. If you answer yes, he says that he's never heard of any so-called Yes Town. And if you say no, he asks if you were born at the bottom of the sea. It's such a fun little meta joke. And this stuff isn't exclusive to the friendly NPCs either. The evil teams get this too. Just south of Mauville City, there's this little island you can surf to with nothing but a tree and a sign with the words Team Aqua was here on it. And in front of the museum, you can get one of the grunts to angrily read a sign to you while he's waiting in line. And then Team Magma has this guy who's stationed in the worst guard duty position, and he says that his left ear is burning up, and the absolutely hilarious intent to steal notice inside of the Moss Deep Space Center. They're not even remotely afraid of getting caught. Both evil teams have so much personality if you pay attention to what the grunts are saying. It really humanizes them while also making them so much funnier in the process. Even if the actual concept of the plot is kind of dumb, it's made so much more enjoyable because you get to fight all these dopey doofuses the whole way through. I really can't overemphasize how many fun little interactions there are like this across the game. Really, if I were to list them all out, we'd just be here for hours. Every third NPC you talk to will have something interesting, cute, or funny to say, to the degree that I end up talking to every single one of them. The only other games where I've ever done that are by Toby Fox, but those are so completely on another level when it comes to charm that it's unfair to even compare them. Regardless, Emerald is easily the most charming Pokemon game I've ever played. It's not even close. So much about it is so cute, or funny, or genuinely interesting in a super down-to-earth way that it makes me want to stick my face through the screen and just live in Hoenn for a while. I can see why Hoenn is such a hot tourist destination in the Pokemon world. The whole place is so quaint and nice that you just fall in love with it. Overall, Emerald's story is fine. It does its job, but it's not amazing. But it's near impossible to hate due to the sheer number of nice little interactions you get with people all across the region. And speaking of the region, Hoenn is quite possibly the best one in the whole series. Personally, I think the region is one of the most important things to nail in a Pokemon game. In terms of what I come to Pokemon for, the thing I always love most is the feeling that I'm traveling the world and finding new, unique locations along the way that I can engage with how I want. The channel Internet Pit Stop laid out 3 things that he thinks a good Pokemon region needs: aesthetic, lore, and stuff to do. First, there's aesthetic. Aesthetic is basically how a route or town looks and sounds. Hoenn really delivers here. Each of the major cities looks noticeably different with their own appeals. Rustboro is all brick and marble, Slateport is all integrated with the ocean, and there's this big market down in the southwest. Fall Arbor is this dirty brown with weird looking dry trees. You get the idea. They all have a feeling to them right from the get-go. Combine that with some great theme music and you've got a distinct vibe for each going in. Then there's the lore. This is basically the story of each city. What are its people like? What's their deal? What made this town look like it does today? For example, in Moss Deep, there's this white rock. It's this little thing that only takes up 1 tile, but there's this lady standing right next to it who talks about how the town sees it as a good luck charm whenever they're shooting off a rocket. Plus, there's some indication that it's a rock from when the Sutopla City volcano exploded, since it's the same color as the rock in the volcano and it's pretty close by. That's a little bit of lore that makes Moss Deep a whole lot more interesting and makes it feel more lived in. I also love Verdanturf, which is this little town with unique grass that looks like it'd be great to have between your toes. The wind blows all the ash that Mount Chimney belches out away from this part of the region, so it has super clean air and some people with poor health will move here to get better. These little bits of info add so much personality to each town. Plus, it is one of the best themes in the whole series, which is playing right now. And finally, we've got stuff to do. This is basically something unique to the city that you can spend some time on. For example, in Lily Cove there's the contest hall, where you can train your Pokemon to be the equivalent of magical show dogs, impressing a judge with how cool or cute they are. It's a pretty complex system with 4 tiers of difficulty and different move combinations that'll give you more points or can sabotage other people. There are also the battle tents, something that Emerald added after Ruby and Sapphire, which are basically like 3 mini battle frontiers in Verdant Turf, Slateport, and Fall Arbor. There's also the game corner in Mauville, and the cycling road south of it, which you can race down for the fastest time, avoiding fellow bikers along the way. And those are the normal towns. Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald are the first games in the series to get really wacky with their city ideas, and they turned out really well. You got Sutopolis, which is this crazy city built in the middle of a giant volcanic crater, like if people were living inside Mount St. Helens. Except it's also an island, so the only way to get into the city is to either dive underwater to enter it or fly overhead. And since it's a crater where the lowest point is the center, the whole thing slopes downward toward the middle in a way real-life cities just can't. Then you've got Pacifilog Town, which is this little floating village in the south built entirely on wooden platforms. This is such a cool idea, like a whole town made of those overwater bungalows you see in pictures of tropical resorts where you can step out of the home and go straight into swimming. And when you walk on the bridges between each building, the logs even sink beneath the water a bit and get your feet wet. These 2 towns combined with Shoal Cave basically save the entire water portion of the game from being incredibly boring, all on their own. And of course there's Fortree City, aka where every kid under the age of 12 wishes they lived. It's a whole city in the jungle where every single person lives in a tree house with a ladder. The people are so in tune with the nature that instead of cutting down trees and ruining the habitat, they built their houses in the canopy, with the little rope bridges going between them. All of the roofs are made of leaves, like the jungle, and the gym is in the middle of this little grotto, completely surrounded by trees. I remember loving this city as a kid. I never had a treehouse, but I always thought they were awesome and fantasized about living in one as an adult someday. Well, now I am an adult, and while I still don't have a treehouse, I can visit Fortree City and get a taste of what it'd be like. So impractical. You'd have to haul a generator all the way up and climb down a whole ladder every time you wanted to go to the bathroom. Even so, I still love this city, and I've never met somebody who hasn't. And all the routes are great too. There's such a huge variety of them, and most of them look pretty distinct from each other. The first few are kind of standard, but then there's this stretch in the middle of the game where every single one of them is cool. Route 110 intertwines with the cycling road from below, 111 is a desert with a giant illusory tower in the middle of it, 112 has the fiery path and jagged paths and is one of only 2 volcano routes in all of Pokemon, 113 is one of the best routes in the whole series and one I'll discuss in a minute, and then 114 has this enormous bridge that transitions into this mountain path before Meteor Falls. There's some great later game routes too, like 119 and 120, which are both these massive, exhausting gauntlets through a tropical forest, and 121, which has these nice metal fences and fancy people for some reason. I actually want to give a special shout out to 113 and 19 in particular. 113 is famous in the Pokemon community for how insanely creative and different it is. There's this huge volcano in western Hoenn called Mount Chimney, and because of the way the winds blow in the region, this strip of land is constantly getting snowed on by volcanic ash. Each new piece of grass puffs a bit when you walk through it, since you're clearing the ash, and if you have the soot sack, you can actually collect all the ash you brush off and use it to make stuff like furniture and musical instruments. It's this gray, snowy hellscape that's completely different from anything I've seen in another video game. And then you've got 119, which is maybe my favorite route in the whole game. First of all, it's easily the longest, and it's divided into different sections, so going through it feels like a marathon. The first section is this whole area with super tall grass and these mimic guys who will repeat all the movements you make. There's also this bike path thing, which only appears on this route and can only be accessed using the acro bike. They're completely optional and unnecessary, but you can get to some pretty unique areas with it where you can plant a secret base if you want. Then there's a super long rope bridge leading to the next area and this place where you can pick between fighting trainers or going to some more super tall grass. Once you're past that, you can get up to the Weather Institute, which is a whole dungeon you do in the middle of the route, after which you can keep going. Then after that, you have a rival battle and then still another third of the route left to go. Game Freak so easily could have put a little town where the Weather Institute is to give a break from the route, but I respect them so much for not doing that. Route 119 is so absurdly long and varied compared to almost every other land route that it ends up being the most memorable part of the game for me. It really taps into that sense of exploration that makes Pokemon fun in the first place. And then there's Feebas. Feebas is an unbearably ugly Pokemon that's infamous for being unreasonably difficult to obtain in every single game that it's in. In this game, you can only find it on 6 specific randomized tiles in this massive pool of water while fishing, and even then there's only a 50-50 chance you'll actually pull one up. Trying to find a Feebas is genuinely a 30 or 40 minute process of slowly combing the whole river for a single tile that will work. But then, once you finally get it and take eons raising its beauty stat to the maximum, it evolves into Milotic, which is my third favorite Pokemon of all time. It's this powerful, majestic sea serpent that is so unreasonably difficult to obtain that it feels like a treasure each time you catch one. So that's all the mandatory stuff, something Pokemon Emerald has down. On looks and vibe alone, the region of Pokemon Emerald is unbelievably memorable. Despite having played Black and White more, Emerald is still the only game in the series where I can tell you exactly what each route and town in the game is like, since all of them are so visually unique. Even if you don't explore out of the required areas that much, it's still a really fun experience, since each new route and town has something special. Speaking of exploration, it's really important to the vibe of a Pokemon game for them to have some interesting optional areas that you can check out on your own. Being able to skip some stuff really makes it feel like it's your adventure, like you're choosing where you want to travel. I still think Black and White absolutely takes the cake when it comes to this. You can check out my video on that if you want more info, but Emerald is definitely second place. There's so many long, completely optional dungeons you can check out throughout the whole game. The abandoned ship is probably the most famous one, this huge shipwreck just sitting in the middle of Route 108. You'll pass by it if you choose to go down past Dewford Town after the 5th gym, but if you remember you can take a shortcut over this water on Route 103, you'll completely skip it. It's full of people touring the wreckage and gives you the TM for Ice Beam, which is super helpful. Plus you can come back to it later once you have Dive, and it'll open up a whole new area that has the TM for Rain Dance and the Scanner, something that you can use to get the items you need to evolve Clamperl. The ship adds so much flavor to a Pokemon game that's so heavily focused on the water. As it turns out, people were going to get rid of the ship, but when they discovered Pokemon had started living in it, they decided not to disturb them and just left the wreckage there. But that's not the only optional thing around. It's completely up to you if you want to explore the desert area of the map. The rival hands you these goggles that let you get past the constant sandstorm, and then basically goes, "Yeah, you can check it out if you want, it's pretty cool. By the way, I'm gonna destroy your dad in the 5th gym, I'll see you later, chump." Then, if you actually decide to explore the desert, you'll find a ton of unique Pokemon as well as Mirage Tower, an enormous illusory building that is only an emerald and only appears about half the time when you enter the desert. It's got all these puzzles you can solve with your Mach Bike, and if you get to the top, you can pick up one of the game's 2 fossil Pokemon before the entire tower crumbles into the sand, as if it never existed. There's so many optional places in the game like this. A personal favorite of mine is on Route 115, where there's this big secret area that I'm guessing a lot of people who played the game don't even know about. You also got Shoal Cave, which has this super unique mechanic where the tides in the cave will rise and fall, meaning that certain parts of the cave are only accessible at the right time of day. Plus, this is the only place where you can find Spheal and the Shell Bell, so it's absolutely worth checking out. The outside of Mount Pyre is required, but the whole inside section, a massive graveyard inside of the mountain, is completely optional, and all it leads to is a bunch of fights with Ghost-type trainers and the TM for Shadow Ball. And then there's Meteor Falls. The game brings you inside there briefly so you know it's there, but since you don't have Surf or Waterfall yet, there isn't much for you to do. But if you remember it once you get those 8 gems, you can come back, explore this awesome looking cave with a bunch of useful items, fight a dragon trainer, and find Bagon, which evolves into Salamence, one of this game's 2 pseudo-legendary Pokemon. And there's so many other areas like this I could be talking about, but if I covered things like the bottom floor of Granite Cave, the Marine Cave, or the new Mauville Underground, we'd be here for another 30 minutes. Instead, the only thing I'll be talking about is the legendary giants. The Reggie Trio has the most awesome, mysterious, and unnecessarily convoluted quest of any of the legendaries in Pokemon history, and it's not even close. If you've never tried to obtain them before, get ready, because this is going to be a trip. Okay, so first of all, you have to find this pool of water where you can dive on Route 134. This entire area of the game is completely optional, and you don't need to go here for any reason, so many players will completely miss it. From there, you'll find a small tablet written in Braille. If you find it, it will tell you to go up, at which point you'll find the opening of a cave. Once you get into the cave, you'll find 6 mounds of rock, each with a piece of the Braille alphabet on them. If you translate it into English, you'll be able to read the message on the back of the cavern, which says, dig here. From there, you figure out that you need to literally use the move dig at that location, which will create an opening in the rock which you can walk through. Then walk into the next room and translate more Braille, which contains an inscription detailing the lore behind the 3 Pokemon. In this cave we have lived. We owe all to the Pokemon, but we sealed the Pokemon away. We feared it. Those with courage, those with hope, open a door. An eternal Pokemon awaits. There's more Braille at the back, which tells you to come back with Wailord at the start of your party and a Relicanth at the back. At this point, there's a good chance you don't even know Relicanth exists, so you have to track down one of them. Interacting with the Braille again with these requirements complete will cause an earthquake that opens doors in 3 other mounds of rock across the region. You've probably found at least one of these before if you've explored a decent amount. They're enormous boulders with 6 other large rocks surrounding them. Find one of them and you can go into the new opening in the rock. Once you're inside, each of the different tombs will require you to read a Braille inscription and then perform a different set of movements to unlock the door to the legendary Pokemon. For the Desert Ruins, move 2 tiles to the left, then 2 down, then use Rock Smash. For the Island Cave, you need to do a full lap around the edge, hugging the wall the whole time, and for the Ancient Tomb, the inscription tells you that those who will inherit our will shine in the middle, which means you have to walk to the center of the room and use the move Flash. Once you've done all these things, the Braille walls for each of the respective caves will open and you can walk through, encountering one of the members of the legendary giants. Whew! This side quest is awesome. It turns you into a full-on Indiana Jones-style archaeologist, deciphering a different language and figuring out puzzles before you can fight one of the 3 legendary golems. And they really do feel legendary, unfathomably ancient colossi which built the entire region. This is the sort of thing that makes exploring in Pokemon fun, that makes it really feel like you're out on your own personal adventure. Even if this isn't for you, I can guarantee there's some other quest like this that is. In fact, all of the encounters with legendary Pokemon in Hoenn are amazing, except for maybe Latios and Latios. You find Rayquaza at the top of the Sky Pillar and can only catch it after going through several floors of genuinely difficult broken floor puzzles below. Then, instead of being a level 40 or 50 like some pansy, Rayquaza is a full-on level 70 Pokemon with a moveset intentionally designed to make it as hard to catch as possible. And then Kyogre and Groudon are the same way, and you have to track them down based on extreme weather events and fight them with their insane high levels and unreasonably difficult movesets. I particularly love that Kyogre has Double Edge. It means that if you get cheeky and use False Swipe or lower its HP down to super low, there's a chance it'll straight up KO itself and make itself impossible to obtain. It's such a mean thing to add in, but honestly, I think it's hilarious. Then you've got the secret bases. These are exclusive to the Hoenn and Sinnoh games, and most people who've played one of the games set there remember them pretty fondly. Every now and then when you're traveling the world, you come across a big tree, a huge bush, or a divot in the rock. If you have a Pokemon with the move Secret Power, you can access each of these to create a secret base, basically a little base of operations for your player that you can decorate and customize. Base. This is where you can put down things like dolls, chairs, tables, and other collectibles that you found or bought over the course of the game. It's not really a complicated feature at all, but one that makes it so you can interact with each of the routes just a bit more than you could otherwise. And I'm disappointed that they never came back. There's one more location exclusive to Emerald that I need to talk about. This is a place that didn't even show up in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and is a big reason why Emerald is often seen as the best Hoenn game. I'm talking about the Battle Frontier. Now, later games have this thing called the Battle Tower, and you might assume that they're the same thing. Well, it's true that the Battle Frontier contains the Battle Tower, alongside 7 other different buildings, all with their own unique battle styles and win conditions. For example, in the Battle Factory, in a match between 2 Pokemon, you can either knock the opponent out or wait 3 turns for your Pokemon to be judged on how well it did, with the winner moving on. There's also the Battle Pyramid, which is a 7-layer structure, each new floor being a maze filled with trainers and clues, which you can complete 3 times. Once you finish it the 3rd time, you can fight Pyramid King Brandon, who will use all 3 Regis against you. You can only bring in 3 Pokemon of your own, and they can't be legendaries, so it's going to be your 3 normal Pokemon fighting against 3 legendary Colossi. And that's just 2 of the 7 battle facilities you can fight. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, all you got was a piddly little island with a grand total of 5 trainers on it. Meanwhile, Emerald has a whole massive complex in the same area with at least a dozen hours of new content. And that game came out 20 years ago. No wonder people like Emerald better. Once you finish the Battle Frontier battle tents and have caught all the Pokemon you want, there's only one thing left to do. Down, in the very depths of Meteor Falls, you can find a man. A legend from the previous games. His team is a force to be reckoned with, easily the highest level of any crew you'll be fighting normally. It's the man, the myth, the legend, and the most powerful trainer in the Hoenn region, Steven Stone. I'm gonna guess that a lot of you don't even know this fight exists. That's because it's only in Pokemon Emerald, not Ruby, Sapphire, or the remakes. His entire team's levels are in the late 70s, and the crew overall is extremely powerful. In particular, his Metagross is unbelievably strong, with 4 moves of 90 base power or above and a ludicrous base attack stat of 135. There's a good chance it'll be one-shotting even pretty bulky Pokemon. Combine that with high defenses and an amazing typing, and you've got easily the most powerful single opponent in the entire game, aside from maybe Rayquaza. The whole fight is awesome, a great last hurrah for the game. It's not quite as climactic as the one from Gold and Silver, but still a genuinely challenging and fun final fight. It's a perfectly fitting way to end this literal gem of a game. So that's it. Pokemon Emerald is incredible. It's not a lot of people's favorites, that usually goes to the Gen 1, 4, and 5 games, but it's possibly the most overall solid Pokemon game there is. You're probably gonna like most of the game, and even the stuff that you don't like is basically never required. So while it doesn't reach the same peaks that a lot of other games do, it doesn't have anywhere near as many valleys either. You know, as much as I love Pokemon Black and White, it is a lot of issues. It can drag a bit, especially early on. Not all of the Pokemon designs are great, and while the story introduces a lot of interesting ideas, it doesn't really expand on many of them to a meaningful degree. But with Emerald, aside from some of the water routes being a bit boring, the whole magma emblem fiasco, and not being able to catch all the Pokemon for some reason, I really don't have any problems with this game at all. For what it was trying to accomplish, it was kind of flawless. It's why everyone loves it so much. You know, if you haven't ever played it, give it a try. For most of the younger people in the audience, you probably aren't that familiar with the games before X and Y, and that's really a shame. There's value in the 3D games too, don't get me wrong, but generations 3 to 5 were kind of the golden age of Pokemon, and it can be hard to understand why without playing one of these games yourself. They're pretty easy to find for free if you know what I mean. Go and check it out, you might like it. Plus, I'd love some more people I can talk about this game with, since the generation that grew up on it is starting to age out of Pokemon. It'd be great if you could add a comment about anything you think I've forgotten in this video, considering how much stuff I basically couldn't bring up due to runtime. If you hated the video, please leave a dislike and a comment telling me how I can improve. If you liked it, and you write for IGN, please give it a 7.8 out of 10, along with some sort of snappy 3-word comment I can use as a running joke. With all that said, thank you, goodbye, and I'll see you sometime in the future.